dinner so far this evening, and it's my very great pleasure now to introduce our speaker for this evening. I'd like to introduce somebody who's a writer and a storyteller, and the narrator and the storyteller of one of Edinburgh's or Scotland's modern-day spectacles and pageants, the Edinburgh military tattoo. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Alasdair Hutton.
Good evening.
That's good. There you go. That's good.
My lords, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honour to be asked to speak at this dinner tonight, and I'm hoping that it won't make the evening suddenly become too tedious for you. But each year, Her Majesty the Queen and members of her family on their way north to Balmoral pause in Edinburgh for Royal Week, usually early in July, although this year it was the very end of June. In the past, when Her Majesty was fit enough to go out and about for short royal visits, possibly to install a new Knight of the Thistle at St Giles Cathedral, crowds lined the Royal Mile to wave and cheer, but usually the biggest crowds were, and still are, to be seen scurrying along the Holyrood for the garden party, under elaborate hats and squeezed into rarely worn morning suits or self-conscious in hired kilts as they weave in and out of the groups of summer visitors to the capital. It's rare that anything of the visit makes more than a mild ripple, but exactly 200 years ago, a royal visit did make the most enormous stir in the capital, indeed, around the country. In August 1822, the newly crowned King George IV was the first British monarch to come north of the border since King Charles II arrived for his coronation in 1651, 171 years before. The timing of this visit was entirely political. The British government wanted to keep the king well clear of the Congress of Verona, an international gathering to settle the balance of power in Europe after the fall of Napoleon 7 years earlier. So, to make sure he was unable to interfere, his courtiers decided that this would be the perfect time for him to make a state visit to Scotland. The courtiers, however, were in a quandary. The new king was widely unpopular among the Scots. Many of them were offended by his appalling treatment of his late wife Caroline, whom he hated and wouldn't allow to become queen. She, on the other hand, had been wildly popular with the British people, who sympathised with her while despising her husband. They cast about for individuals of sufficient reputation who might manage the royal visit. In the end, there was only one possible choice. One man capable of organising such a royal visit and making a success of it was Sir Walter Scott. Sir Walter was determined that the entire visit would be one long, lavish production, a crowd pleaser on a scale the nation had never known before, and he drew on the advice of his friend, the young actor manager, William Henry Murray, whose talents at creating scenery and costume were put to superb use. Staunch royalist and ever the great romantic, Sir Walter saw this as a wonderful opportunity to rebrand the unpopular monarch in the mould of Bonnie Prince Charlie. It was vital that George IV looked the part. As a Stuart prince and a Jacobite Highlander, Sir Walter declared that the king was properly entitled to wear the kilt, and he set about ensuring that he would wear it well. As a result, the king spent what in today's money would have been about £120,000 on a bright red Highland outfit using some 100 metres of satin, velvet and cashmere, bearing the tartan we know as Royal Stuart. With it went a military-style red tunic, an elaborate goatskin sporran with a massive gold top, appropriately diced hose and buckled slippers, and a bonnet consisting of the Royal Scots crown in miniature set with diamonds, pearls, rubies and emeralds. To them were added gold chains, a dirk, a sword and a set of pistols. Sir Walter left as little as possible to chance, going so far as to publish and sell for £1 an outline of the events planned and behaviour expected, entitled Hints addressed to the inhabitants of Edinburgh and others in prospect of His Majesty's visit by an old citizen. Nowadays, during the period of the Festival Fringe in August, that section of the Royal Mile from the foot of the Lawn Market down to North Bridge is crowded with a motley collection of wannabes, all showing off various acts, from staying absolutely still to performances of exotic and intricate movement to attract crowds and exact cash. But in 1822 it was even more flamboyant. Sir Walter Scott used the whole of the Royal Mile, end to end, from Holyrood up to the Castle battlements, for a succession of mobile events. The King's 60th birthday was on Monday the 12th of August 1822, and he arrived in the Firth of Forth 2 days later. By then, it was raining so heavily that the King decided to delay his landing until the next day. But Sir Walter was undeterred, and in spite of the rain, he was rowed out to the yacht, the Royal George. The King rewarded him by exclaiming, "What? Sir Walter Scott, the man in Scotland I most wish to see." After a toast in whisky, Scott asked for the King's glass as a memento. It was carefully wrapped up and stowed in what he thought was his safest pocket. When he returned home, he found the English poet George Crabbe waiting for him. Scott threw himself into his chair, only to hear the ominous crack of breaking glass as the precious royal keepsake shattered in his pocket. The next day, in happy contrast, the sun shone and the King, wearing naval uniform, stepped ashore in Leith onto a red carpet strewn with flowers. He was met by a guard of more than 50 members of the Royal Company of Archers, the sovereign's bodyguard in Scotland, to which Sir Walter had been elected the previous year. After the usual salutations for a royal visit, the King set off in an open carriage with the bodyguard of archers marching alongside in an enormous procession. Scott's son-in-law John Gibson Locker described the scene. Lines of tents, flags and artillery circled Arthur's Seat, Salisbury Crags and the Calton Hill. The castle and its rock were wreathed in the smoke of repeated salvos, while a huge royal banner, such as had not waved since 1745, floated and flapped over all. The cavalcade passed cheering crowds all the way to the top of Leith Walk, where at a theatrical medieval gateway the keys to the city were presented to the King, and he was formally admitted, accompanied by a huge crowd on Calton Hill singing the national anthem. Such a positive reception was something that would have seemed out of the question only a few months before. The procession continued on to the Palace of Holyrood House, where the King was greeted by another guard of honour from the Royal Company of Archers and formally presented with the keys to the palace. However, Holyrood was too run down to be a royal residence, so the King had to journey on to stay at the 16-year-old Duke of Buccleuch's residence of Dalkeith Palace, which in its turn is nowadays looking a bit seedy itself. 2 days later, the great and the good queued at Holyrood to get a closer look at their monarch on the only occasion on which he wore his wildly expensive kilt. Despite the cost, it wasn't a perfect fit. King George's bloated legs were covered in buff-coloured trousers like flesh to imitate the royal knees. When someone complained that the kilt had been too short for modesty, Lady Hamilton Dalrymple wittily responded, "Since he is to be among us for so short a time, the more we see of him, the better." On Tuesday the 20th, a throng of nearly 500 richly dressed ladies, most bearing coloured ostrich plumes above their elaborately curled hair, crowded into the King's drawing room at Holyrood. Custom required that the courteous and smiling King kissed each one on the cheek in such a crush. Some either received no kiss or didn't remember feeling the royal lips. Lady Scott and her daughter, Sophia and Anne, were among the lucky ones. On Thursday, the 22nd of August, a grand procession from Holyrood to Edinburgh Castle took place in heavy rain. The procession, with the King's closed carriage, proceeded slowly up the Royal Mile, flanked by colourful bunting and densely packed cheering crowds, obscured by their umbrellas. The windows and the balconies along the length of the street were all covered with green, red or scarlet cloth. At 1 o'clock, the different public bodies and corporations and trades took their places lining the street, with crosses on their breasts heather or thistles in their hats, and most of them holding white rods in their hands. The Society of Gardeners displayed a floral triple feather, remembering the years the king had spent as the Prince of Wales, and the officer of the Society of Glass Blowers wore a glass hat with a glass sword and target, each of his members carrying a long glass rod. The important dignitaries, dressed in magnificent costumes, rode on horseback, but Sir Walter, dressed in the Windsor uniform, a type of formal dress worn at Windsor Castle only by members of the royal family and very senior courtiers, walked up the centre of the street along with two other gentlemen and was loudly cheered all the way. After receiving the keys to the castle from the governor, Lieutenant General Sir Alexander Hope, the king mounted a platform on the Half Moon Battery in full view of his cheering subjects who had gathered on the castle hill. One of his attendants was worried that the king would get wet. "Oh, never mind," replied His Majesty, "I must cheer the people." And taking off his hat, he waved it repeatedly and loudly gave 3 cheers. The weather didn't let up, but it didn't dampen the enthusiasm of either the crowds or the king. Instead, it added a wild and romantic effect, with the broken outlines of crags and cliffs and the city's buildings emerging through the mist. The crowd made the air resound with repeated acclamations, and the king exclaimed, "This is wonderful! What a fine sight! I had no conception that there was such a fine scene in the world, and to find it in my own dominions. The people are as beautiful and as extraordinary as the sea." He was not accustomed to this kind of reception. On the evening of the following day, Sir Walter had organised a Highland ball. The much sought-after invitation had thrown many lowland gentlemen into a state of high confusion as they hastily embarked on a desperate search for Highland ancestry and ordered kilts from the Edinburgh tailors. Working round the clock to meet the demand, they responded with a creative flair for finding or inventing something suitable. This was the society event which established tartan and kilts as the national dress of Scotland. The assembly rooms had been theatrically transformed by William Henry Murray for the occasion. Instead of the kilt, however, King George appeared wearing his Field Marshal's uniform and thoroughly enjoyed watching the kilted dancers whirl through their reels and strathspeys. He'd made it clear that while he was in Scotland, all music should be purely national and characteristic, and Sir Walter ensured that those instructions were followed to the last note. Although the king left before midnight, the ball continued until past 1 in the morning. The king's next major appearance was on the Saturday night at a huge civic banquet given by the Lord Provost, Sir William Arbuthnot, in the great hall of Parliament House, which Murray had decorated with colourful tapestries. And after it, the king declared, "This is one of the proudest days of my life," and he expressed his heartfelt thanks to the people of Scotland. 2 days later, the king made a private visit to the Holyrood House apartments of his ancestor, Mary Queen of Scots. The palace had been hastily redecorated for the visit, but the old, faded and disintegrating fabrics clearly showed a sad air of neglect. The king declared that the historic apartment should be preserved and maintained for posterity, insisting that the government make a grant for the essential repairs needed. King George made his last and least formal public appearance the following evening when he attended a theatrical performance of Scott's Rob Roy, adapted and produced by William Henry Murray in the Theatre Royal. The king heartily enjoyed the performance, following the play closely and laughing especially loudly at the wit and innocent sarcasms of Baillie Nicol Jarvie. The highlight for him was when the Baillie told Frank Osbaldiston that he would have nany of Lunnon tricks. The royal visit ended on Thursday the 29th of August with a brief visit to Hutton House, where elaborate arrangements had been made to serve a sumptuous lunch. The king, mindful that he was about to take to the North Sea, ate only turtle soup before he joined the Royal George again at nearby south of Queensbury and set sail for home. Just as it had been on the day of his arrival in the Forth 2 weeks before, the weather was wet, with the crowds waiting to see the king off. Sir Walter declared, "It is right that Scotland should weep when parting with her good king." even with the level of detailed planning on which Sir Walter had insisted. The King's visit to Scotland had been a risky venture, but as the monarch sailed off down the further port, all those involved must have shared a sense of huge satisfaction and understandable relief. It had been a triumph, increasing goodwill within the Union and establishing a newfound Scottish identity, which continues to influence the way the world thinks about Scotland today. Sir Walter's attention to detail when it came to the symbolism of events had united Highlander and Lowlander in ways that would have previously been unimaginable. One of the lasting spin-offs from the royal visit was that the King's eldest son, Prince Albert Edward, was the first heir apparent to make use of the title Duke of Rothesay since the union of the crowns in 1603, and the heir to the throne has continued to use the title ever since. While the King was at Edinburgh Castle, Sir Walter had taken the opportunity to express regret that the mighty siege gun Mons Meg had been taken to London after the Jacobite rebellions. His Majesty was sympathetic, and after a lengthy correspondence with the Canon's official guardians at the Tower of London, including the Duke of Wellington, the gun was returned to Edinburgh Castle in 1829. Sir Walter Scott had pulled off a phenomenal triumph, which reflected his many remarkable skills. He transformed the nation's attitude to its king, and the king's attitude to his Scottish subjects. Scotland was changed forever by the imagination of Sir Walter Scott and that royal visit 200 years ago.
Alasdair, for such a fascinating account of the events of 200 years ago. And particular thanks for arranging those fireworks to come perfectly on time as well. That was marvellously done. And so it remains for me to raise a toast to somebody who 200 years ago would have been either congratulating himself for 2 days of very good work or putting a lot of hard work in for 12 days of work to come. So ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to join me in a toast to Sir Walter Scott. Sir Walter Scott.